Good morning. Good morning, Yuma. Welcome. I'm Jane Haycock, the CEO of the International Development Contractors Community. It's a pleasure to be here at the Crawford School of Public Policy. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We welcome distinguished guests joining us here today, including Her Excellency Camilla Solomon, High Commissioner of Nauru, and Mr John Carley, High Commissioner of Papua New Guinea. Thank you all for joining us, whether in person or online. We encourage you to live tweet this event via the hashtag election22. This is the second in a series of 3 election forums offering the major political parties a chance to articulate their thinking on international development, their future policies and plans. These forums have been organised through a collaboration between the International Development Contractors Community, the Australian Council for International Development, and the Development Policy Centre here at the ANU. We have come together because all 3 partners share a deep interest in Australia's international development policy. With the recent events in the Solomon Islands, we are seeing for the first time in a long time aid and foreign policy issues playing a prominent role in the Australian election campaign. And we are delighted that all 3 major parties have accepted our invitation to speak on where international development sits in Australians' foreign relations, their vision for making our development efforts as effective as possible, how they would maximise the impact of the development programme, and the resources they would dedicate to the development programme and its management. So today we are eager to hear from Pat Conroy MP on Labour's priorities for reshaping the development programme to respond to current and future opportunities and challenges. Pat Conroy is the Australian Labor Party's Shadow Minister for International Development and the Pacific. He has been the federal member for Shortland since 2013. He's also Shadow Minister assisting for climate change, defence and on government accountability. He holds an economics degree and has been active in the labour movement from a young age. After working for many years in the union movement, Pat worked in senior roles and as Deputy Chief of Staff to Greg Convey. Following his address, Pat Conroy will be joined in conversation by Louise Maher. Louise worked for many years in radio as a journalist, presenter and producer, including 25 years with the ABC and 7 years in the Federal Press Gallery. Her podcast, Collected, shows the stories behind the artefacts in the Australian War Memorial, and her award-winning audio app for the National Portrait Gallery, in their own words, matches oral histories with artworks. Louise is an MC, moderator, media and public speaking coach and an accredited editor. Please join me in welcoming Pat Conroy, ALP spokesperson for International Development and the Pacific.
Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. And I really look forward to a conversation about what I see as an incredibly important election, not just for Australia, but for our international neighbours. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And can I acknowledge the various members of the diplomatic community that are here today. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate the engagement that you all have had with both myself and Penny Wong, Labor's Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, over the last 3 years. I've been Shadow Minister for International Development and the Pacific for almost 3 years now, and I've been fortunate enough to engage with all 3 hosts today, both the ANU, Dev Policy, ACFID and IDCC, and I'm really fortunate that you and your member organisations have been so generous in helping inform our international development policies. These policies, which the Australian people will have their say on in only 12 days' time, are not only policies that I believe will benefit Australians and our neighbours, they also help re-establish Australia as a partner of choice for countries in our region in meeting the economic development, climate and security challenges of our time. But in addition to strengthening partnerships with our nearest neighbours, we also need to rebuild our international development program and ensure that Australia pulls its weight in tackling challenges faced by developing nations around the world. This isn't just the right thing to do from a humanitarian perspective, but as evidenced by the security pact recently signed between China and the Solomon Islands, it is clear that nearly a decade of successive cuts to Australia's aid program are leaving a vacuum for others to fill. And this has deep strategic implications for our region and for our own security. While we should be wary of securitising the aid debate, and it's something that I'm very conscious of, it's apt to remember the statement from former US Secretary of Defence James Mattis when discussing development and diplomatic funding, and he said, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." And those comments have been echoed by successive CDFs in an Australian context. I want to talk firstly about values, because values need to drive everything. My good friend, Labor's Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, has stated that Labor's foreign policy is founded on the belief that we deal with the world as it is and we seek to change it for the better. This means a foreign policy that is not transactional, but is purposive. There is no greater example of this approach to international development from our point of view. Our approach will be driven by goals defined by our values, interests and identity. Those values are of fairness, equality and compassion. Our primary interest must always be the security and prosperity of the nation and our people. But this has to be in conjunction with our deep and abiding commitment to a stable, prosperous and peaceful region anchored in the rule of law, with public goods that give form to our values and are preserved and defended. Now, Australia is confronting changes in the balance of economic and strategic power, economic and social inequality, rising nationalism and challenges to the liberal rules-based order that are reshaping the world before our very eyes. Even before the pandemic, the pace of poverty alleviation had been slowing, geopolitical tensions had been rising, and international cooperation was coming under strain. And we now face a global pandemic which has hit the world's most vulnerable people hardest and which is creating economic scarring that will hinder development for years to come. According to the World Bank, COVID has seen the number of people living in extreme poverty rise to 732 million in 2020. The number of people struggling to survive on less than US $1.90 a day is now 30 times the entire population of Australia. That's an increase of 77 million compared to 2019, and that's 97 million higher than what was projected for 2020 before the COVID downturn hit. 2020 was the first year in the last 2 decades to see an increase in the level of absolute poverty. The impact of COVID on hunger has also been stark. According to the Food and Agriculture Organisation, the number of people facing hunger rose to 768 million in 2020, an increase of 118 million compared to 2019, and the highest level of global hunger since 2005. The economic impacts of the COVID crisis has fallen hardest on low-income countries and within low and income countries on the poorest members of these communities. Economic depressions in a number of countries have led to political and civil instability and rising crime levels. The world made unprecedented gains in the 1990s and 2000s, largely on the back of the transformative economic growth in East and South Asia. Yet before the COVID pandemic hit, this growth had slowed. Between 1990 and 2015, the global extreme poverty rate fell by 1 percentage point a year. However, between 2015 and 2019, the poverty rate fell by less than 0.5% a year on average. So 0.5%, a halving of growth out of extreme poverty. Getting poverty reduction back on track will require developmental partnerships that boost sustainable and equitable economic growth. It will require increased support from the international donor community. It is and international development is a critical element of Australia's foreign policy. It's one of the key ways Australia engages with our region and the world. It's an important expression of our values as a nation, and it advances Australia's national interests in a secure, stable and prosperous region. And fighting global poverty is not just the right thing to do, it's squarely in Australia's national interest. Australia has a responsibility to assist and secure our region in the face of growing strategic challenges, including through the aid program. It is in our country's interest to reduce poverty, hunger and despair, because these are among the root causes of instability, conflict and violence around the world. Through overseas aid, Australia contributes to economic growth and stronger institutions in developing nations, and we build our relationships with the governments and people of our neighbouring countries. That will improve our ability to work with neighbouring countries on shared challenges and to advance Australia's foreign policy and national security interests. Development policy is a key component in the toolkit for Australia's international engagement. It is one of the many reasons why Labor has been so concerned about the Liberal government's cuts to Australia's foreign aid budget. The cuts to Australia's official development assistance have totalled more than $11.8 billion since 2013. Under Scott Morrison's watch, Australia's ODA has fallen to a record low as a share of national income. And while we've welcomed the very temporary supplementation to ODA in the last two budgets, it has not repaired the damage done over the last 10 years of coalition government. The damage of cutting in half aid to Indonesia since 2014-15, or cutting aid to sub-Saharan Africa by 77% over the same time, or cutting health assistance to Samoa literally during their measles epidemic, or cutting governance assistance to the Solomon Islands by 41.5%. Now, as I said, the aid program not only delivers life-saving assistance, but contributes directly to the stability and resilience of our region. It works alongside our strategic, diplomatic, economic and people-to-people ties to deepen Australia's partnerships in the region, restore Australia's leadership and credibility, shape our region and counter behaviour that's against our interests. And Labor's plan to rebuild Australian international development is a key part of our commitment to a strong and principled approach to national security and a self-reliant and ambitious foreign policy. Australians are generous. In 2021, Australia ranked 5th in the World Giving Index, reflecting the willingness of Australians to help a stranger, donate to charity and volunteer. Our international development program should again reflect the generous spirit of the Australian people. It's something that we should be proud of as a nation. At Labor's National Conference, we committed to increasing the ODA budget. As importantly, we also made clear that our ODA activities will be focused in the following areas: poverty reduction, equitable access to quality health and education services, economic development and infrastructure investment, climate change and environmental sustainability, sustainable agriculture, forest and fisheries management and food security, water, sanitation and hygiene, good governance, global humanitarian crises, empowerment of people with disabilities and gender equality, empowerment of women and girls as a key objective, including ensuring at least 80% of Australia's aid investments address gender issues and tackling violence against women and children. And what I'm keen to see, if I am fortunate enough to be Australia's next Minister for International Development in the Pacific, is a reorientation of our aid budget towards investing again in human capital, investing in our fellow human beings. What we've seen over the last 9-10 years not only is deep and enduring cuts to foreign aid, but a reorientation of how that aid is spent that, quite frankly, I think is counter to the interests of the countries we partner with and Australia's national interest. Labor has already announced that if we form government, we will increase Australia's overseas development assistance to the Pacific by $525 million over the next 4 years. This is funding additional to the existing ODA budget, including the supplemental ODA funding announced in the federal budget earlier this year. It will not include a diversion of funding from other ODA priorities. This is a really important point. Every single dollar of that $525 million is new money, additional to the supplementary aid budget increase, and will have zero diversion. This is a critical point because the government's failed Pacific Step Up was funded by a step down everywhere else in the world. And our national interests have suffered as a result of that, and the globe has suffered because of that. Labor will shortly have more to say about our ODA resourcing and priorities for Southeast Asia and for the rest of the world and multilateral institutions. However, if I can use our Pacific policy as an example of our multi-dimensional approach we will take to securing our region. The Pacific ODA announcement was one part of a much broader announcement detailing how a Labor government would repair the damage done to our relationships with the Pacific under Mr Morrison. The broader package was designed to support the development and security goals of our Pacific friends. It included restoring Australia's climate leadership, as well as listening and acting on Pacific Island warnings on the existential threat of climate change, and we'll do this through establishing a Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership, in addition to our bid to co-host a future conference of the parties in Australia, importantly with our Pacific partners. Delivering an Indo-Pacific broadcasting strategy that boosts Australia's public and commercial media content to audiences in our region, increasing training for Pacific journalists and enhancing partnerships with broadcasters in our region, establishing a new Australia Pacific Defence School, doubling Australia's funding for the Pacific Maritime Security Program to help Pacific governments to recoup some of the $150 million a year in revenues, which are estimated to be lost due to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. That announcement is as much about economic assistance as security assistance. It is a critical industry for Pacific Island nations, and a future Labor government will back their efforts towards greater revenues from that source. Importantly, we'll be reinstating the regular bipartisan parliamentary Pacific visits to demonstrate to the Pacific family that stronger Pacific partnerships are in Australia's national interest. I am frankly amazed that Foreign Minister Louise Maher ceased that program. I can't think of anything more powerful than Julie Bishop when she was Foreign Minister and Penny Wong as Shadow Minister visiting Pacific Island nations to demonstrate and emphasise that no matter who is in government in Australia, that those Pacific nations have an enduring partner. Why Maurice Payne cancelled them is beyond me. We'll also be addressing Pacific economic challenges and easing Australia's agricultural worker shortages by reforming the seasonal worker program and expanding the Pacific Labour Scheme. And I want to pay tribute and thank the many people in this room who have been so vocal on this issue and have contributed to our policy development process, and boosting our people-to-people links across the Pacific family by encouraging more Pacific permanent migration to Australia through a new Pacific engagement visa. I want to highlight the importance of the last two elements in particular. Labor is committed to reforming the Pacific labour schemes to make them the primary source of temporary migrant labour for the agricultural sector, as well as other regional industries such as tourism and hospitality. We will do this by making the schemes more attractive to Australian employers and Pacific Islanders, and at the same time we will increase the protections to stamp out the appalling cases of exploitation that we've seen. This is the right thing to do to fill a labour shortage we are seeing right now in rural and regional Australia, as well as supporting the economic development of our Pacific friends. 1/3 of Pacific Islanders live on less than US $1.90 a day, the UN definition of absolute poverty. A 2017 World Bank study found that the seasonal workers program was making a significant contribution to the economic development of Pacific countries. Over 6 months in Australia, the average Pacific seasonal worker remits around $2,200 and transfers $6,650 in savings home at the end of their stay. Departmental evidence is that there are 55,000 pre-screened Pacific workers. If all 55,000 were able to fill labour shortages in the long-term Pacific Labour Scheme or the new Palm Agricultural Stream, and using World Bank averages, the remittances set back to the Pacific homes could amount to $850 million in additional income for these Pacific nations. I use this figure to highlight the potential of partnering with the Pacific to help with our labour shortage as a great way of complementing our aid expenditure. I'm as excited by our announcement of a Pacific engagement visa. This is a revolutionary step in advancing our people-to-people links in the Pacific. And I don't think people outside this room, to be quite frank, have fully appreciated how significant a step this is. Up to 3,000 permanent migration visas will be allocated annually. This will more than quadruple the number of Pacific Islanders settling in Australia. In 2019-20, for example, only 721 Pacific Islanders obtained permanent migration visas, or just 0.5% of Australia's total migrant intake. The 3,000 annual figure means that over time our Pacific diaspora will build up significantly. These policies use the power of Australia's proximity, as well as our strong cultural and family ties with the countries of the Pacific, to our shared benefit. Two further elements that we'll work on with our Pacific friends closely is advancing their economic security and their human security. I'll be keen to work on how we can grow local employment within the Pacific Islands using our ODA investment, and this is a really critical point. Unlike other nations, I would expect when Australia invests in countries through our ODA budget that benefits Pacific Island workers, not workers from donor nations. On human security, there is no greater challenge for the Pacific and in fact all developing nations than climate change. The 2018 Boy Declaration categorically stated that climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security and well-being of Pacific people. Yet this government's refusal to take climate change seriously has been a slap in the face of our Pacific neighbours that they like to call a family. Who needs family if they blatantly disregard an issue you see as your greatest threat? An Albanese Labor government would take serious and meaningful action on climate change. Our Powering Australia plan will reduce Australia's emissions by 43% by 2030, which will become Australia's target under the Paris Agreement, keeping us on track to achieve net zero by 2050. Scott Morrison says his government is committed to net zero by 2050, but his coalition is hopelessly divided on it, with Barnaby Joyce implying that it is non-binding. Labor would further demonstrate our commitment to take real climate action by bidding to host a future COP with Pacific countries. I had the honour of representing Labor at COP26 in Glasgow last year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that Australia felt like the naughty kid in the class. We had our Prime Minister giving a speech to an empty hall. The main focus of this conference was getting countries to commit to increasing their 2030 emissions reduction targets, and it was something that the Prime Minister ruled out before he even got to Glasgow. Other countries looked at Australia as a climate laggard. And something that stopped me in my tracks when I went to COP26 was a sculpture on display in Tuvalu's pavilion. Had anyone seen that sculpture of the polar bears and the penguins? This sculpture was a powerful symbolic representation of the existential crisis that Pacific nations face if countries like Australia don't start taking strong climate action. If Labor was elected and able to implement our strong climate policies, that will give us an opportunity to host a conference of the parties with our Pacific friends to demonstrate how seriously we take climate change. Only an Albanese Labor government will take climate change seriously, and only Labor, therefore, will ensure Australia is a trusted partner and a true member of the Pacific family. As I highlighted above, aid is a key enabler of development, but we must work to bring together other elements of Australia's engagement: diplomacy, trade, labour, mobility and private sector investment. Recognising this requires a change in mindset in both the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the development sector. An Albanese Labor government will rebuild Australia's international development program by boosting funding, increasing capabilities in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, working with Australian aid NGOs and contractors, and improving transparency and accountability in the aid program. All those with a stake in international development must come together and align our engagement so that Australia's contribution has maximum impact in disrupted times. Better alignment and coordination will be a key imperative for an incoming Labor government. The level of outsourcing of our international development program gives rise to legitimate concern that these arrangements are driven more by lack of capacity or risk aversion rather than a focus on improved development outcomes. Richard Moore's review of the AusAid-DFAT merger published in February 2019 noted that, and I quote, "According to the former head of AusAid's Human Resources Department, almost 1,000 years of expertise left shortly after integration, and estimates suggest another 1,000 years of experience has been lost since." An Albanese Labor government will focus on working with DFAT to build development capability and ensure it is prioritised and valued. Greater recognition of and demand for this capability will not only be good for the department, it will be good for the countries we partner with and good for Australians, increasing confidence that taxpayers' dollars are achieving the intended outcomes and supporting our national interests. We want to rebuild and reward aid and development skills within the department. We would expect graduates to be trained in the basics of aid design and management, just as they are trained in the basics of the department's other areas of work. And we will be keen to see experience in development roles within the department being highly prized for career progression. Development postings should be seen as a good, if not critical for career progression. I want them as highly prized as a posting to some of our more prestigious missions overseas. Only through that can we rebuild the development capacity within the department. Linked to this is making sure Australia's ODA spend is effective. The dismantling of the Office of Development Effectiveness was a retrograde step by the government. The ODE has played a critical role in ensuring Australian taxpayers' aid funds were spent wisely and in assessing whether Australia's aid investments are achieving real outcomes in improving the lives of the poorest people in the world. Australia can no longer be confident their aid dollars are being spent effectively. In government, Labor will examine how we can improve confidence in our ODA expenditure. Labor also understands and appreciates the invaluable work Australia's aid NGOs do. I want to thank Australian aid NGOs and contractors for their ongoing work, particularly during the COVID pandemic. And I'm pleased to announce today that an Albanese Labor government will increase the Australian NGO Cooperation Program funding by $32 million over 4 years. The ANCP, I'm getting a clap from Ackford, so that's good. The ANCP provides funding to accredited Australian charities and NGOs for projects to help people in developing countries with healthcare, education, preventing violence against women and children, and tackling hunger and deprivation. Aid NGOs are important partners with the Australian government in delivering development projects and in supporting civil society in developing countries. Supporting civil society promotes better governance and institutions in developing countries. Now, under the ANCP, charities and NGOs also contribute their own funds raised from the Australian public to ANCP-supported projects. In addition to the $32 million commitment, Labor will provide $2.3 million in grants to Australian Rotary clubs to support their contribution to the Global Polio Eradication Initiative and help tackle one of the most important health challenges in developing countries, particularly in South Asia. The grants would support polio eradication and also allow Rotary clubs to redirect their own fundraising activities towards Indigenous health issues such as trachoma. We also recognise the vital role development contractors play, and I thank them for being part of today's function. Labor will not get bogged down in sectarian arguments about aid delivery. We will partner with everyone who is committed to lifting the world out of poverty. All three methods of aid delivery have a strong role to play, and they should be judged on their effectiveness rather than the organisation itself. And we also recognise the vital role, I'm also very excited about a future Labor government working to develop new forms of development finance to complement Australia's ODA. There is considerable interest globally in innovative approaches to development finance, including guarantees for investments in development projects, provision of insurance and or first loss cover and equity stakes in development projects. These are seen as having the potential to boost the effectiveness of grant funding by leveraging investment in development from the private sector, financial institutions and multilateral institutions. Official development assistance around the world is measured in billions of dollars. Yet the World Bank has noted that eliminating extreme poverty by 2030 and boosting income growth amongst the world's poorest 40% will cost trillions of dollars every year. Private sector funding will have a critical role to play. One example is the rise of billionaire philanthropists. There are around 2,000 billionaires around the world with combined assets worth some US $9 trillion. Just over 200 of these individuals have signed the Giving Pledge, committed to donating more than half of their wealth to philanthropic causes. DevEx co-founder Raj Kumar has argued that a tidal wave of philanthropic funds is looming, based on existing commitments over US $500 billion, or more than 150 years of Australia's current levels of ODA. Australia must help shape these opportunities. Accordingly, I'm also announcing that a Labor government will establish a DFAT-led review to examine new forms of development finance and develop policy options for consideration in government. This has been a long neglected part of policy making in Australia. So in conclusion, we're living in a time of disruption in which the magnitude and nature of change shapes Australia's strategic, economic and foreign policy interests. Accompanied by humanitarian crises of unprecedented scale, it's essential that Australia's international development program meets the challenge of these times. Australia's aid program is a key pillar of our international engagement and enables our ability to build a region that is stable, prosperous and respectful of sovereignty and resilient to threats. The aid program not only delivers life-saving assistance but directly supports our foreign and defence policies to deepen Australia's partnerships in the region, restore Australian leadership and credibility, shape our region in our interests and counter behaviour that is against our interests. Labor's plan to rebuild international development is a key part of our commitment to a strong and principled approach to national security and a self-reliant and ambitious foreign policy. Labor's international development program will speak to who we are, the confidence we have in ourselves, the values we believe in, and to the region and world we want to live in. So thank you again for your time, and I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Pat Conroy, for that comprehensive outline of and insight into Labor's values, priorities and plans. I'm sure there will be a question from the floor about that announcement. We do love an announcement, yes. A fresh announcement at a forum, so thank you for that. We'll be taking some questions from the forum sponsors in just a minute. We'll be taking questions from the floor, and also there's media here today, so there'll be media questions as well. But I'd like to jump in first with a question of my own. It's a multi-pronged question. The ALP platform states that Labor is committed to increasing aid spending to at least 0.5% of gross national income, and that funding will increase every year, starting with a Labor government's first budget. My question would be, how quickly will you be able to do that? How much of an increase would you be pushing for in a first Labor budget? And can you guarantee that the funding increase of 0.5% would be delivered by the end of Labor's first term in office? And also, as a subsidiary question, what priorities would you set for the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, that is indeed a multi-pronged question.
I'm sure you can cope.
Well, I'll tackle the big one first. Look, repairing Australia's ODA budget is going to take a long time and concerted resources. We're now down to, I think, on current government projections, an ODA to GNI ratio of about 0.18. And to give you some context for that, when we left government, it was up to 0.33. So we've seen almost a halving in Australia's aid budget as a percentage of GNI. So I'm not going to give you that guarantee about reaching it in the first term. But we have committed to increasing Australia's ODA budget each and every year of a Labor government, starting with our first budget, which if we do win the election, we will have one this year. We've already made a down payment on that by announcing the $525 million for the Pacific element of the ODA, and as I said in my speech, you can expect announcements shortly on our priorities for Southeast Asia and the rest of the world and multilateral institutions. But in terms of priorities, the Pacific's clearly really important, and it was really important before the security pact with the Solomon Islands. I think that's very important to emphasise that we have not just woken up to it now. Southeast Asia is equally critical. I can't emphasise how short-sighted it was of this government to halve assistance to Indonesia. This is our one of our nearest neighbours. It is a critical country for security in Southeast Asia, and not just halving of aid. In the lead up to the COVID pandemic, the Australian government cut health aid by something like 86%. So Southeast Asia is going to be another key priority for us as well. So I'm hopeful that you'll see more announcements shortly about our resourcing decisions. But I ask people to look at our track record. We take international development seriously. We regard it as a critical arm of our broader international foreign affairs and security policies, and that will be reflected in our priorities in government.
What figure do you think what funding increase do you think would be achievable? If you don't think you can reach that 0.5% in the first term, what do you think would be achievable? What would you be aiming for?
If I told you that figure, the esteemed members of the Fourth Estate would be able to then say Labor commits to X. We'll make our priority, make our decisions about resourcing.
Why shouldn't we be able to say what Labor's trying to achieve?
You will, and you're absolutely right, and that figure will be released before the election. So people will be able to see what our resourcing priorities are for overseas development assistance before the election. That'll be...
So within the next 2 weeks?
Within the next 2 weeks.
Okay. All right, let's go now to some questions from our sponsors. And the first question will come from Richard Moore. Also, I'd just like to ask you, when you do ask a question, when we take questions from the floor, if you could just say your name and indicate where you're from, that would be helpful to all of us in the room. So Richard Moore is from the IDCC, the International Development Contractors Community. Richard, your question.
Thanks very much. I'm having to rephrase my question, Pat, because it is, as you would anticipate, about capability, but you've anticipated that and you've actually said that there's a bit to do in terms of rebuilding the department's capability, and that's fantastic. I guess I'm going to ask you sort of, what's your plan for bringing all of that together? You talked about incentives, you talked about skills. What's going to drive that? How are you going to keep it at the top of your agenda? And are you going to be able to tackle DFAT's need for a blood transfer, blood infusion? Because actually there's a problem. It just doesn't have enough bodies and enough funding. And the last element of this is you mentioned ODE, which is fabulous. Are you committing to the restoration of an independent evaluation capacity?
Good questions there, and always good to get a question from someone I quote in a speech. On the last question, we haven't landed on a discrete and defined way we intend to engage on development effectiveness, but we absolutely acknowledge that we need to restore that capability. We need it from both ensuring that Australian taxpayers' dollars are spent wisely, but as importantly, to make sure that we build the case for aid. One of the reasons Anthony Albanese put me in this portfolio is I don't come from a development background. I'm an economist by training. I represent an electorate that is a regional electorate that, let's say, often I go to forums where I get questions like, why are we spending money on foreigners when there's homeless people in Australia? Which is a really legitimate question. But we can only win that debate and persuade people about why overseas development assistance is in our interest if we measure it properly and we evaluate it properly, and we can demonstrate that. So we are very committed to putting in place processes to restore that capability. The exact model we haven't yet landed on because, quite frankly, we don't have the resources in opposition to do that. And that's why, in terms of how do we restore DFAT capability, we'll work with the department. Penny Wong's one of my closest friends in politics. We work very closely together, have done for a couple of decades. So I'm really looking forward to the partnership that we'll have in government if we're lucky enough to win the election and Anthony Albanese chooses to keep me in his portfolio. But I think that we recognise that there's a power of work to do in that area, and we recognise that while we can't unscramble the egg of AusAid integration into DFAT, we can do many things to elevate it within the department and give the department the resources it needs to be amongst the world's best development agencies. And that's our aspiration, obviously.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Mark Purcell from ACFID.
Thanks, Mr Conroy. flagged that it was announced over the weekend that Labor will host with Pacific Island states a COP. With the aid program, what tangible things would Labor hope to do on climate change?
Yeah, no. Well, we've announced obviously the climate infrastructure financing facility, or partnership rather, but we also in our values statement very clearly have argued that climate is one of the key areas of ODA that we want to pay attention to. So I think that without being overly prescriptive, because we always get in trouble when politicians make decisions about aid expenditure, the two areas that I think are most logical is one on mitigation measures, so investing in things like renewable energy projects within the Pacific, and that obviously contributes to their economic independence. And secondly, on adaptation. There's clearly an element of climate change that is already occurring that's going to be baked in even if the world manages to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we have an obligation to help nations who quite frankly have contributed next to nothing, if not nothing, to climate change, to protecting their people and their society. And so I think adaptation is obviously something that's going to be very important. It's complex. I remember having a conversation with an academic talking about how we support adaptation and doing things like moving roads and infrastructure, and he was making the point that sometimes roads get rebuilt in the exact same spot because of complex land ownership within islands. So it's no good for us just to say we're going to help countries move roads. We also have to understand and be culturally sensitive to some of the barriers that face that. But I think both increasing energy independence and investing in renewable energy is one part of where I think we can help, and also adaptation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Beth Orton from the Development Policy Centre.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about migration reform from Pacific Island countries, and specifically the Pacific Engagement Visa. We note that there's a visa allocation of 3,000. Would there be a focus on particular Pacific Island countries in that allocation?
We've indicated that it'll be done on broadly a pro rata basis. And I think this is partly reflecting, it's the fairest way of doing it, quite frankly. Although it will be very interesting because we obviously have New Zealand that has a very strong engagement with the Polynesian region within the Pacific Island nations. One area where I'm keen for us to build bigger links is with our Melanesian neighbours, and I acknowledge our PNG representative here. They are some of the largest Pacific Island nations, yet our people-to-people ties aren't as strong as they could be. But our intention at the moment is that 3,000 will be allocated on a pro rata basis.
Thanks, Pat. So questions now from the floor. Yes, up here, please. And just a reminder, just to state your name and where you're from. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. John Morley, Plan International Australia. And first wanted to thank you for the pledge to ANCP. That's great. And just to say that's a very absorbative and effective program. So if you're looking for more, that would be fantastic. But my question is in relation to Pacific regionalism. It's not something that you covered in much depth in your talk. There's been a lot of focus over the last many years around the bilateral relations in the region, which are obviously important, but regionalism is part of the architecture, and it's a complicated architecture with the Forum Secretariat and SPREP and SPC and a whole range of them. What's Labor's view on the role of regionalism in the Pacific, and are you prepared to invest in that?
The short answer is we see it as critically important, and we are very interested in investing in it. I think that the Pacific Islands Forum is obviously going through an inflection point at the moment, and we don't have access to all the confidential briefings, obviously, that governments do, but we are keen to work with the region to restore the PIF, to be quite frank, to what it should be. But we see it as having tremendous power. But the first step that Australia should do is engage in it in a respectful way. And the two examples I alluded to in the speech is first, we've signed up to the Boyd Declaration. We're actually subject to the Boyd Declaration from the 2018 PIF that said that climate change is an existential threat to our region and we'll take action on it. So we've signed up to something, but not only do we ignore it, we actively sabotage it. So I think respect for PIF outcomes is really important. The equally important is how we engage at the PIF. Like Mr Morrison's behaviour at the 2019 PIF was an absolute disgrace. And I say that very clearly. His arrogance, his bullying behaviour not only was deeply disrespectful to our Pacific neighbours and undermined the PIF, it undermined Australia. So much so that obviously we had the comments from Frank Bainimarama that his behaviour would push nations towards China. He said that on the public record in August 2019, and look where we are now. And it's not just at a leadership level. I remember I was talking to the leader of one of Australia's aid organisations, and he was relaying the story that pre-COVID he'd caught an airport from an airport in Fiji, and a taxi driver was talking about Morrison's bullying behaviour. Now, when the taxi drivers of Fiji are worried about Mr Morrison and his behaviour at PIF, you know you have a problem. So I think us engaging properly in the region is really important. That parliamentary visit piece, while it sounds bureaucratic, is actually really important. Having Julie Bishop and Penny Wong spending 10 days in the region each year is all about building that regional partnerships, and the PIF is vital to that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Up here, thanks.
Thank you, Mr Conroy. You spoke about a reorientation.
Oh, sorry, could you just say your name?
Sorry,
From? Thanks.
I'm Dane Moores from World Vision Australia. You spoke about a reorientation of aid towards human capital. It's a very strong point, but very brief. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean by human capital and what has been the orientation to date away. If Australia's aid program today is not about human capital, then what do you see it as being about now?
Well, I think the reorientation takes two forms. One is just a straight cut. So if you look at where the $11.8 billion of cuts have occurred, they have disproportionately impacted on what I would classify as investing in the health of populations, of recipient populations. So I gave the example of the 86% cut to Indonesian health assistance. Cutting Samoan health assistance was another example. Cutting education assistance to Timor-Leste is another one. So where the $11.8 billion have been cut has been disproportionately in those areas of investing in the people of those countries. And secondly, part of it is, I think, sometimes an overemphasis in hard economic infrastructure. I'm an economist by training, so I recognise the productivity and economic benefits of hard infrastructure, and often that's what nations we're partnering with want, and ultimately we have to be guided by what countries and their leaders want. But there's no point building a road if no one's healthy enough to drive on it. And that's something that I'm really focused on. And if you look at the sort of recovery from the COVID pandemic, yes, there's been an economic depression that it's caused, but the health impacts are going to be felt for decades. Not just long COVID, but also the vaccination regimes that have been missed because of the focus on COVID. Drug-resistant TB is an example, polio, just all the standard immunisations that aid helps with. A lot of that has been missed because of the quite right focus on COVID. So I think investing in the health of nations is really important if we're to play our full role in the international arena.
So would you say that health would be the top priority?
Well, I'd be nervous about saying there's one, but health has to be amongst them. I think education is another. Gender empowerment is vital. Like, it is something that when this government walked away from a commitment to having 80% of programs having a gender objective, I found that incredibly short-sighted. So I think that health, education, gender are critical drivers of that investment.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Sakya Stamir, Deputy High Commissioner at PNG High Com. Thank you, Mr Conroy, for the very good presentation. And I'd like to thank ANU for organizing this event. Now, interesting times, campaigns are going on, and we are keenly watching, gluing ourselves on the televisions. And of course, for PNG, we are also going into elections within the next 2 months. And so when we're looking at the other campaigns in Australia, you're talking about putting more money into the pockets of families and electricity bills and all that. And of course, we are going into our elections as well. And when I'm making some comparisons, you've got things here. For us, let's say 80, 90, 75 to over 80% of our population really do not have much of the things that Australian politicians and your parties are talking about here. And so when we're talking about the ODA program, I just firstly I'd like to wish you to both parties. We need to be neutral, so all the best for the best team. Now, in terms of the ODA, I come from a rural community up in the highlands, and that is where 80% of our population live. And so, coming from that area, for us, of course, when you talk about elections, you're talking about the regional security and the Pacific and so on, and we are featured there, which is quite important. And for us, the broader regional security is important, but then for us as countries, I think our national sovereignty, our nationhood, our democracy, our territorial integrity, these are very important to us. And on top of that, what is more important to us is providing health service, education, infrastructure. We are faced with these challenges. And for PNG, we count on Australia as the serious development partner, and that we need to seriously engage with you in terms of our development journey. Now, for us, in a lot of the communities, during the former Australian administration, we had airports, we had health services, education services, airports. These were functioning. And at the moment when you go into some of these places, if you take back some of these patrol officers, they'll be very disappointed in the situations they find. And so when it comes to the aid program, for me, development of a country is a serious business because we need to transform communities. We need to see development indicators increasing. And so for PNG in some of these places, I think it's not a question of money. We lack capacity. We don't have the governance system, the administrative system, in the running of our education services, the health and agriculture. At the foreign affairs and diplomatic level, we're talking about export and imports. Basically, in some of the majority of our communities do not have the economic base. There is nothing happening there. And so when it comes to the ODA program, of course, you can talk about building a school. How does that transform a community? How does that improve the education system? And when you're talking about agriculture, I think there is nothing on the ground for most of the communities. So how can we transform the communities and get some economic activities going? Now I think we really need to look at serious engagement at the community level. We need Australians on the ground for 5, 10, 15, 20 years to take us on a journey to improve our systems, to improve our agriculture. I think just putting infrastructure here and there is fine, but I think we need to really look at how can we get the countries and communities up and going. And we need the patrol officers back. We need the Australians back to our communities, our districts, And our provinces, if we have to really deliver and to see real changes taking place in our communities. And so these are some points I'm raising here. But again, I'm happy to hear some perspectives on this because I think we need to really look at how we are engaging in terms of our aid programs in the region so that we can actually achieve tangible impacts on the ground where 80% of the population benefit. Thank you.
It's about community and community engagement and communications.
No, thank you, Your Excellency, and thank you for coming today. You're absolutely right, and I think one of the things that I've heard a lot from both representatives of nations in our region and, quite frankly, people who come out of AusAid is that our aid spending, besides the cuts to it, has become increasingly transactional in nature. It hasn't been about developing long and abiding developmental partnerships. It's about short-term diplomatic bushfires, spot fires, and putting them out through aid. And so what both Penny and I have signalled, that we're keen to re-engage more fully in the region in a respectful way and partner. And I think that's one of the things that AusAid did best, was those long and abiding developmental partnerships, not just fly in, fly out. And that's why I really appreciate you coming today. And I can say an Albanese Labor government will be in for the long haul with our Pacific friends. And it's about listening to what your priorities are and working out how we can invest in your priorities in a long-term and sustainable way so that in 10 years' time we're not having the same conversation.
So just another comment. That's on the Pacific engagement, the visa that you talked about. That has been a very serious issue for PNG for a long time. We are from a colony. And I think there is people from all over the world flooded into this country. They're benefiting from the prosperity and security and so on of this country. And we are from a colony, and we have always been struggling very hard. And bringing up the issue about coming to Australia has been always difficult for Papua New Guineans. And this announcement by your party would be very, very interesting to us. And we are looking forward to really seeing that. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I was up in Cairns a few years ago and was raised by the local PNG community. And I think, as I alluded to the earlier question, PNG makes up by population about 80% of the Pacific Islands, but our people-to-people links there is not as strong as they should be. And that's why both the Pacific Engagement Visa and our various Pacific labour schemes have to be reformed so that our people-to-people links are deepened with our closest neighbour and a neighbour that constitutes 80% of the Pacific region by population.
Thank you. Another question now.
G'day, Pat. Stephen Jedgetts from ABC News. Can I ask briefly on climate policy and your pledge to hold a COP? A number of Pacific leaders or former leaders, including Inote Tong, have said that Labor should make greater commitments to cut carbon emissions if it wants to host a COP, and that without that commitment in particular on a steeper decrease in carbon emissions and also taking a hard look at thermal coal exports, there's only limited value in the proposal. So can I ask, do you see your climate policy and your Pacific policy as two separate silos? Do Pacific concerns have any impact on Labor's willingness to make steeper cuts in the future, or do you see the current target that you've outlaid as the final offer, as it were?
Thank you for the question. As our leader has made clear many times, our policy is our policy, and we'll be taking it to the election and we'll be legislating that target. I don't think people, and I respectfully disagree with some of the assertions that are contained in that question. They're legitimate points of view. I'm not disrespecting that. But I think people underestimate how significant a 43% emissions reduction target is. First off, the government's current policy of 26% is full of accounting tricks, and they've made no significant headway in it. So currently, our emissions have been cut by 20% since 2005, on 2005 levels. Of the 20 percentage points, 14 percentage points occurred under Labor when we were last in government. Of the remaining 6 percentage points, 5 percentage points were because of Labor's renewable energy target that this government's tried to abolish 3 times. They can only claim credit to 1 percentage point of the emissions reduction, and that's because of the COVID recession. They literally had to shrink the economy to shrink emissions. So they've done nothing to achieve that 20% so far. So it's going to be a real challenge for us to get up to that 43%. We're confident we can get there because, as has been stated, we constructed policies and then asked the modellers to tell us how much emissions reduction that would achieve. So we're very confident about the practical impact of our policies. But I think just as Australia signing up to the Kyoto Treaty in 2007 as the first act of the Rudd government symbolised a re-engagement on climate change that was lacking under John Howard, Chris Bowen, as Labor's climate change minister, if we're elected, submitting a revised NDC of 43% will signal to the rest of the world that we're serious about taking action on climate change. So, of course, people will want us to do more, but we think 43% is practical, it's deliverable, and it's a good pathway to get us to net zero emissions. But partnering with the Pacific on the financing facility is really important, and being a global leader in technology is the best way forward. On thermal coal, our policy is very clear. As a climate policy economist, I'd make the point that asking Australia to account for the emissions related to thermal coal burn overseas is equivalent of asking the government of Japan to be responsible for emissions coming out of Toyota cars in Australia. It is not the way the international accounting procedures work, and it would actually lead to double counting that would be counterproductive. So we've got a good target, and I think us signifying our re-engagement in international climate negotiations will be a breath of fresh air in our region.
Thank you. Thank you. We are reaching the end of our allotted time, unfortunately, but just something that I've been thinking about since you said it right at the start. When you go to meetings in your electorate and that person says, why do we have to give money to people overseas when there are people living on the streets in Australia? What do you say?
Well, I say a few things. One, good governments don't have to choose. Good governments can find the resources to do both. And obviously we've got policies to do both, which I won't spruik now. Secondly, it is in our direct national interest to support regions around the world. And I'll give you an example that's reshaped the Middle East. Probably the most direct cause of the civil war in Syria was a famine that led to the decimation of Syrian farming, that led to a massive influx of people into the Syrian cities. And that was the tinder that created that. Obviously there's other factors, but that destabilised Syria and was a key contributor to the civil war. So if we're serious about a peaceful world, and in particular a peaceful region, we need to invest in the region, and obviously the Solomon Islands issue sort of further emphasises that. But thirdly, I say most Australians are actually deeply generous. As I said, we're the 5th most generous country on earth, private individuals, and I think Australians want their government to reflect that. And it's interesting, when I've seen public polling done by organisations, when they ask people why they support the ODA budget, that security argument isn't the strongest. The strongest argument is they're our fellow humans. We've got an obligation to help our fellow human beings. Our humanity should not end at our territorial borders. It's not in our interests, and it's certainly not in Labor's values. So I use those 3 arguments.
I think that's a nice point to end on. Thank you very much. And I'll now hand back to Jane.
Thank you very much. So maybe you can just join me again in thanking Pat Conroy and Louise Maher for an important and very stimulating conversation. And thank you all again, whether you're joining us in person or online. In partnership with ACFID and the ANU, we will be co-hosting one more election forum. On Friday at 10:30, Minister for International Development and the Pacific, Senator Zed Seselja, will present the Coalition's platform. So we hope you enjoyed today's event, and please join us for the last one in the series. Thank you.